The Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel written by Oscar Wilde in 1891. Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin in 1854 into a wealthy family. Wilde was a brilliant student. He attended Trinity College in Dublin, and during his studies he showed a nonconformist personality. He was not very popular with his fellow students or even among his teachers. Wilde later won a scholarship to the University of Oxford, where he became popular for his eccentricity, his wit, and his brilliant conversation. While in Oxford, he became a disciple of Walter Pater, and his theory profoundly influenced Wilde's life and works. From Pater, Wilde learned that art had no didactic and moral purpose. He adopted a lifestyle based on aesthetics and began to behave and dress extravagantly. For this reason, Wilde received many invitations from London-liked society, who were completely fascinated by his witty statements. Oscar Wilde traveled a lot. He went to Italy, Greece, and the USA. When he returned to his homeland, he married Constance Lloyd, and they had 2 children. In the 1818s, Oscar Wilde wrote a series of short stories such as The Canterville Ghost, The Happy Prince, and The Other Tales, which he wrote for his children, and his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, in which he expressed his aesthetic theories. Oscar Wilde also wrote many successful plays, including the tragedy Salome and comedies such as Lady Windermere's Fan and The Importance of Being Earnest. Both Salome and The Portrait of Dorian Gray damaged his reputation for obscenities and immorality. Oscar Wilde was immensely popular, but things began to get worse when he began a homosexual relationship with the young Lord Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie. The Marquess of Queensberry, Bosie's father, accused him of homosexuality, which was considered a criminal offense at the time. Wilde was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in Reading Gaol prison. In these years, he wrote 2 very important works: The Ballad of Reading Gaol, on his experience in prison, and a long autobiographical letter to Lord Alfred Douglas, De Profundis. When he got out of prison, Oscar Wilde was a dead man. He had lost everything, even his wife and children, and the public opinion was against him. He decided to leave England and moved to Paris under another name, Sebastian Memorf. Here, he died of meningitis in 1900. The aesthetic movement developed in the universities and intellectual circles in the last decades of the 19th century. It began in France with Théophile Gautier and reflected the sense of frustration of the artist, his reaction against the materialism, and the restrictive moral code of the bourgeoisie. As a result, French artists withdrew from the political and social scene and escaped into aesthetic isolation, into what Gautier defined art for art's sake. This doctrine was imported into England by James McNeill Whistler. However, the roots of the English aesthetic movement can be traced back to the Romantic poet John Keats. In this movement was so important the influence of Walter Pater, who is regarded as the main theorist of the aesthetic movement in England. Pater's work had a deep influence on the poets and the writers of the 1819s, especially Oscar Wilde. He rejected religious faith and said that art was the only means to halt the passage of time. He thought life should be lived in the spirit of art, namely as a work of art. The main implication of this new aesthetic position was that art had no reference to life, and therefore it had nothing to do with morality and did not need to be didactic. The picture of Dorian Gray is a novel. The novel is a genre of fiction written in prose. It has very ancient origins, dating back to the 11th century. For his masterpiece, Wilde revives the novel of the manners of the Victorian age. The novel is set in 19th century Victorian London, which at the time was pervaded by a typically bourgeois mentality. It tells of an handsome young man, Dorian Gray, who will come to make his beauty an insane ritual. He begins to realize the privilege of his charm when Basil Hallward, a painter, gives him a portrait which he reproduces in the prime of his youth. Lord Henry Wotton will have a decisive role in the life of Dorian. At Hallward's studio, in fact, Wotton, with his speeches, negatively influences Dorian, who begins to look at youth as something really important, so much so that he feels envious of the portrait of himself, which will be eternally beautiful and young as he grows old. Dorian comes to stipulate a pact with the devil, thanks to which he will remain eternally young and beautiful, while the painting will show the sense of the character's physical decay and moral corruption. After a tormented love affair with a theatre actress named Sybil Wayne, which ended with the girl's suicide, Dorian, seeing that his figure in the painting ages and takes threatening grimaces every time he commits a ferocious and unjust act, hides the painting in the attic. Every so often, however, he secretly goes to the attic to check and mock the portrait of him, as he ages and becomes ugly day by day, until, tired of his heavy life, he tears the picture with a knife. Eventually, the servants find Dorian dead with a dagger stuck in his heart, unrecognizable and preciously withered, at the foot of the portrait, who has returned wonderfully young and handsome. The boy protagonist of the novel is an orphan who has been left with great wealth. He is young, beautiful, and innocent at the beginning of the story, but then, after declaring that he would give his soul in order to never grow old, he will follow a dissolute and amoral life, for the time in accordance with the current philosophy of aesthetics and anti-Victorian age. The meeting with Wotton is the reason for his downfall. The dandy makes him open his eyes to his beauty by persuading him to consider his beauty a gift and a weapon of seduction, through which he can get whatever then Dorian desires to remain young forever. He turns out to be corruptible and weak. He looks at the painting, feels envy, sells his soul in exchange for the eternal youth of the painted building, but his life will be marked by emptiness and corruption. Dorian is completely obsessed with the eternal youth he possesses, by using it for evil purposes. When he finally realizes who he really became, he is struck with the cruel remorse for the evil done and stabs the painting, hoping that this will break the spell. In fact, the curse is broken, but the picture, now intrinsic to Dorian's soul, tearing itself apart, causes the death of the protagonist, who is found with the true likeness of him. Wilde is halfway between Victorian and modern novels. In his novel, there is a contrast between appearance and essence, between what is visible to the eye and what is intimately hidden in each of us. From the Victorian age revives a novel of manners. It dealt with economic and social problems and described a particular class or situation. This story is told by an obtrusive third-person narrator. The sentences have a complex structure. The vocabulary is sophisticated and complex, but at the same time modern and implicit. There is an evocative use of a language, and it is cleverly differentiated. The various characters have a different vocabulary based on the importance and social role they play. The portrait is the key that allows us to open a reflection on a theme that marks the entire work: Narcissism. The mythical ancestor of Dorian Gray is found in Book 3 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The young Narcissus, as shown in the painting by Caravaggio, approaching a spring, and struck by the image of him reflected in him, falls madly in love with it. Narcissus is at the same time subject and object, lover and loved, desiring and desired. What excites the sight of him is a deceptive illusion, that ghost of a reflected figure destined to disappear as soon as the young man looks away. Similarly, Dorian's portrait reflects his consciousness and his true I, by serving as a mirror of his soul. However, this theme first appears long before, with Wilde's contention with 19th century realism. The fear that Dorian shows at the sight of the disfigured portrait, the dedication to drugs, and even to crime, can be considered an expression of the anger that he gives off in seeing the true self of him. What unites the two young people is a desire which, not finding its fulfillment in the outside world, finds its answer in its own reflection. Narcissus and Dorian can be considered the two exponents of one of the characteristics of modern men: fascination for oneself. Engulfed by their own image and the victim of their own gaze, they become the architects of their own intellectual and physical death. Dorian, like Narcissus, falls in love with his own image, and is eventually destroyed by it. Number 1. No one can be said to be truly indifferent to the passage of time. To a more or less intense extent, man has tried since the dawn of time to leave a sign of his ephemeral passage in the world. Thought, art, force, heroic deeds or words, to be able to die knowing that he left his mark. This feeling is linked to the fleetingness of existence, to the awareness of having to grow old and die. Dorian's fate suggests that eternal youth is only an illusion, and that the passage of time is a constant in human life that cannot be eliminated. Number 2. Vanity as the original sin. Dorian's physical beauty represents his most precious attribute of him, and his vanity his most terrible vice. All Dorian's action, from his desire of an imperishable beauty to his final, desperate act of destroying the portrait, are motivated by vanity. Even his attempts at altruism are dictated by the desire to improve the aspect of his soul. Dorian's fall from grace, therefore, is the consequence of his decision to embrace vanity. In the preface of the novel, Wilde invites us to think of the inevitability of vanity in our relationship with art, when he states that it is the spectator and not life that art actually reflects. If we see ourselves in art and find that art is beautiful, it follows that we, like Dorian, are in fact admiring our beauty. Number 3. The dual personality of the characters. Many of the characters in the novel are extremely concerned about their reputations. Both Lord Henry and Basil Hallward advise Dorian on how to best preserve his status in the eyes of the others. When crimes are committed, no one cares if there will be personal acquittal, but only if the guilty party is deemed such by the public. In this way, each character possesses the awareness of a dual personality, one praised by the audience and one defined by the audience itself. The figure of Dorian is an allegorical representation of this statement. The portrait is a literal visualization of Dorian's private self, the state of his soul, while Dorian sees himself perennially young, handsome, and innocent. Number 4. The value of beauty and youth. Man has a deep attachment to youth, the most beautiful age of life by far, and the idea of growing old and dying is for some an obsession. Lord Henry claims to appreciate beauty and youth above all else. It is this way of believing, when instilled in Dorian, that causes the protagonist to do what will ultimately damage him. When Dorian realizes that he will keep this youthful appearance, he considers himself free from the moral constraints that imprison the common man. He takes physical appearance more into consideration than his soul state, which is openly enlightened by the continued degradation of the portrait. This superficial belief in the final consideration of youth and beauty is therefore the driving mechanism for the protagonist's damnation. In this way, the picture of Dorian Gray can be read as a moral warning against the harm of keeping one's appearance first and not keeping one's conscience in mind. Number 5. Influence and corruption. At the beginning of the novel, Dorian is an innocent young man. Under Lord Henry's influence, he becomes corrupt and eventually begins to corrupt other young people himself. One of the main questions is where to place a person's responsibility for improperly committed act. The novel could be seen as a lesson in accountability for one's actions. However, in observing the conditions of others, Dorian emphasizes their propensity rather than considering the role he himself may have played in their downfall. Number 6. Homosexuality. This is the theme Wilde alluded to when he wrote Note of Doom, that like a purple thread runs through the cold cloth of Dorian Gray. A letter to his young lover, Bosie, after his disastrous appearance in court. He defines homosexuality as a note of doom because sodomy and homosexuality were severely considered illicit in Victorian England. In the novel, we read strong homosexual references between the main characters, Dorian, Lord Henry, and Basil Hallward. In revising the novel before the official press, Wilde removed the most striking reference to homosexuality. However, the idea of the gay relationship was too ingrained to be erased completely. Indeed, some think that Wilde, through the pages of the novel, wanted to resolve this conflict of him. A conflict that had free rein in the pages of De Profundis. De Profundis is a long letter that Wilde wrote after being tried for homosexuality to his partner Alfred Douglas in 1897 during the period of his incarceration. The title of the work foretells that the writer will dig deeply into his soul to express thought, memories, and intellectual evolution that characterized and accompanied his stay in prison. This book is truly the final passage in Wilde's life, his last work, his spiritual testament. But De Profundis also clarifies the relationship with Bosi, whom many have wanted to idealize. It is not true that between the two was an idyllic love story, broken by the homophobic and intolerant climate of Victorian England. It is true, on the contrary, that Wilde was totally suffocated by the young Alfred, a dissolute, superficial, and opportunistic boy, of to which, however, the great Irish writer had become literally succubus. For the accuracy and the erudition of the periods, it is inevitable to retrace step by step the events of the writer's life in prison. The purpose of the epistle is essentially pedagogical towards the young Lord Alfred Douglas. Indeed, Wilde intends to bring the young man's conscience, so atrophied by hatred, to a stage of maturation and understanding. In the first part, Wilde sets himself the goal of explaining the great behavioral differences between himself and Douglas. In fact, although the two come from the same social class, their way of dealing with life is very different. Oscar attended university with flying colors. Douglas was lazy at school. Wilde kind and adherent to love, Douglas violent, at times vulgar, and dominated by hatred that so much interfered in the artistic production of the writer, and tore his vocation to art in the periods in which the two met. In fact, Wilde's time with the young man proved fruitless. Full bitter but wise words, Wilde does not stop for a moment to blame himself for the weakness shown towards Alfred, who was not only a proponent of his incarceration, but also of the bankruptcy that marked the period of poverty until the end of his days. Another figure who showed himself in all his wickedness, ignorance, and coarseness was that of the father of the Narcissus Alfred, John Shorto Douglas. The presence of this man was instrumental in Wilde's downfall. The letter ends with a piece of advice for Alfred that is not to be afraid of the past. What is best to do is accept it and move on. It is important to underline that the letter is really difficult to read, because it is marked by great pain. Only those who are in a moment of great suffering can understand his words. In fact, there is a sophisticated and profound vocabulary, a strong and frequent use of paradoxes, metaphors, hyperboles. The letter then crosses different themes, from repentance to reproaching his lover, up to showing itself as a missive of forgiveness and love. The magnificence of the poet can be found in these pages, which effectively outline the description of a profound, generous, attentive, and altruistic man, even though the poet himself defined himself Dorian's alter ego. Depth and the courage of his words are unmatched. In conclusion, Wilde entrusts the manuscript of the work to his faithful friend Robert Ross, begging him to make 2 copies, one of which he was to send to Lord Alfred Douglas. The letter was published posthumously in 1905. In addition to cinema, the work also influenced in ballet. In 2008, the choreographer Matthew Barnes stages the Dorian Gray Ballet with a soundtrack by Terry Davis. In 2018, on the occasion of the renewed summer tour Roberto Bolle and Friends, Roberto Bolle created Dorian Gray, based on choreography by Massimiliano Volpini and music by Alessandro Quarta. Comics. The number 15 of Satanic, the portrait of Alex Bay, August 1965, is a substantial transposition of the novel. In Zagor, The Master of Time and the Stone Assassin, 1987, there is a story clearly inspired by it. In 1996, the weekly Mickey Mouse published a parody entitled The Portrait of Uncle Scrooge. Music. Dorian Gray's opera, libretto by Paolo Masino and Beppe De Tomasi, music by Franco Mannino at the Massimo Bellini Theatre in Catania. In the Lost album XD, released on January 25, 2008, there is a song inspired by the love story between Dorian Gray and Sybil Vane entitled A New Scene. The author is Walter Fontana. The Demons and the Wizard track Dorian featured on the Touched by the Crimson King album is inspired by the novel. In musical, in 2002, the Italian director Tato Russo creates a musical version of the novel. The critically praised show continues for 4 years of reruns. In 2016, the Dorian Gray musical theatre version was presented at the Teatro La Fenice in Venice as Dorian Gray, Beauty Has No Mercy, a production of the Maison Pierre Cardin, conceived and written by composer Daniele Martini.